Today's topic, if you can see the board, I probably cannot see the board, so here it is. I say 10:53 this morning. Got some new pictures. I hope y'all can see this. The name, the title doesn't really mean that much. We're going to get into some transportation things first, but overall, we're going to talk about the early 19th century, or at least we can say at least the first half of the 19th century, and I'm going to be referring to the Northeast, and by that I mean mostly everything from Washington, D.C. north, and so that would include New England as well as New York, as well as the Middle Atlantic states like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland. Sometimes people consider Maryland a southern state because it was a slave-holding tobacco state, but for now we're just referred to it mostly as a northeastern state or middle Atlantic state. Then there's the South, okay, and the South, of course, has this very different economy, slave labor, and plantation and rural, and culturally quite different. Not nearly as diverse as the Northeast would become. And then we have this region that we can refer to as the Great West, which today we would generally refer to as the Middle West or the Midwest. And so today I want to talk about how the Middle West became attached to the Northeast, because this was not always the case, strangely enough. The Northeast and the South kind of competed for connections to the Midwest. And at first it was generally New Orleans that was the outlet for the Middle West. But that would all change with some technological changes that we're going to focus on today. So here you're looking at a washed out small version of this population map, and I don't know if you can see it really well, but you'll be able to see it better online. The shaded portions, there are a couple of different shades, and you can't even really see them here. A little darker shade is greater than 6 people per square mile, and then the yellowish is 2 to 6 people per square mile, and then the white areas that are part of the organized territory are less than 2 people per square mile. So it allows us to see in the 1790 census, the very first census count, some population concentrations around the Bluegrass, the Nashville Basin, Upper East Tennessee, and the forks of the Ohio River at Pittsburgh. That's basically it. The state of Georgia was really just a sliver along the border with South Carolina at this time. Native American lands were sort of blocking the expansion into the South. But that's not really what I want to talk about today. We want to talk about the connection of the Northeast to the Middle West. By 1800, you'll notice not a lot has changed. Most of the new populations are river-based, or they're just increasing population in those earlier areas. So I talked a little bit about this idea of a turnabout in trade. Remember that? The turnabout was initially, it was a turnabout from a focus on Europe and the North Atlantic and trade with Europe from these port cities of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore generally, and that turnabout turned to sort of an interior focus from an Atlantic focus was kind of forced on us, all right? We might back up a little bit and remember that why in the world was New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, why were they focused on the Atlantic trade right after independence? And the reason was there was an advantage. They had a huge advantage because of the Napoleonic Wars. And the fact that the British and the French were at loggerheads, were belligerents, and this opened up an advantage to the Americans, to the United States. So we took advantage of that for as long as we could, and that began to end in about 1807 with Jefferson's attempt to create an embargo on trade in Europe, but it didn't work, and his second attempt didn't work either. So, and then the Second War of Independence, or the War of 1812, led to the invasion of Washington, D.C., as you all know, and really the loss of this advantage on the high seas after the end of the Napoleonic War. So the British had command of the high seas. The British had the best information had the best nautical charts. The British, of course, would establish things like the International Dateline and the Prime Meridian that everybody adopted, the world adopted, and so the Prime Meridian runs through Greenwich, England, 0 longitude. That wouldn't be until a little bit later, but in the United States, it became apparent that we had lots of resources in the interior, we had lots of land, and development would be focused on the interior. And hopefully that would allow us to produce surpluses that, of course, nobody's sitting around, except academics maybe, thinking about all of this. It's just happening. It's organic. Well, what I want to talk about, though, is the transportation development that occurred in the Northeast during this period before the Civil War, this antebellum period, okay? Antebellum, most of the time when people use the word antebellum, they're usually referring to the 1850s, to the period, from especially 1854, or maybe the Missouri Compromise in 1850. Okay, that's an important one associated with slavery. And then the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, which pretty much started the Civil War in Kansas. And then, so that's sort of the antebellum that most people often refer to. But technically, you can say, well, it's anything before the Civil War. So we're going to say anything before the Civil War in this case today. So that great turnabout in American economic development refers to that rapid switch of U.S. entrepreneurs from the Atlantic-oriented to the interior-oriented development. And we'll see the processes here that were going on. This, I think you saw this slide also, but what I want you to remember is that when I say things like New York City captures the Great Lakes, okay, via the Erie Canal, I don't mean that DeWitt Clinton, mayor of New York City and governor of the state of New York later, was out to capture necessarily all of the trade. And it's not like there's Team New York City. It's not like New York Yankees or the Giants or something like that. What I'm saying is there are certain entrepreneurs within New York City, or maybe investors from these places, that know that they'll benefit from these developments. They'll benefit from better accessibility. Accessibility is what we're really talking about. A geographical term refers to a transportation advantage. So that accessibility is what they're reaching for, and the idea is that they're going to benefit from getting getting access, easier access to the interior, to the farms and to the raw material supplies of the interior so that they can engage with international trade. So these are all cities that are looking west, but they're also involved with international trade, and so they're naturally going to be these interested places, I guess, if we can say that. Just a few notes here. New York City, of course, wound up being the prime beneficiary of the major transportation development of this period, the Erie Canal and the canal system. So what happened was, even though the canals, sort of evolved, all of those eventually tended to focus on Chicago and New York City. Baltimore and Washington, two cities very close together, attempted a connection. And the funny thing here was that, one observation you might make is that the Baltimore-Washington attempt to go west was from the very earliest, assumed to be kind of a federal government prerogative. I'll talk a little bit more about that. In other words, it was assumed to be kind of a national attempt at reaching west. New York City was the example of sort of state, what we might call today state capitalism, or the state made a big investment and it actually paid off. Okay, it was a good call, although it wasn't necessarily, and everybody wasn't enthusiastic about it during the period. Can you think of any examples like that around our experience or in your own lifetimes, when a state or a city or something decides to tax its citizens in order to do something far out that is going to bring in lots of money? Well, heck, it's over and over. Yeah, go ahead.
Sports.
Like what example?
Like when a team wants a new stadium, taxpayers get to pay that in order so they can build it.
Okay. Does it always work? No, not always. But I have a couple of really good colleagues, good friends here in the geography department who wrote a paper once. They're sport geographers. They're interested in the sort of the urban economics of sports. And they wrote this paper and got it published called "Why Oklahoma City Will Never Have an NBA Team."
What year is that?
They wrote this like about 95 or 99, something like that. Because they're all talking about, oh yeah, Oklahoma City will have an NBA team someday and it'll be great. And they said, are you kidding? That can never happen, So anyway, they were proven wrong. And we have the Oklahoma City Thunder coming to Oklahoma City was just one part of this grand plan that the Oklahoma City refers to as MAPS, right? What's that stand for? Metropolitan Area Planning something or other? Okay, so when did that get started? Like 1995 or even earlier than that? It was early 90s, I think. 97. So anyway, they're still doing things with maps. They're still, and really early on, I have to admit, they were sort of just doing a copycat of San Antonio with the canals and stuff and the canal boats. It's like, it's Oklahoma City. They don't have a river. Anyway. So, but it worked out. It worked out pretty well. And I think most people in Oklahoma City are kind of proud of that. And I mean, 30 years ago, Oklahoma City versus Tulsa, all right? You would say, oh, Tulsa's a lot nicer place. Tulsa's got a lot more edge on Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City is just like a old cow town, oil boom town, nothing built since the 1960s. It's ugly and all this stuff. Now it's a tourist destination. So anyway, it's possible. It's possible. I will admit it, as someone who wants to tends to think of themselves as someone who, favors the free market over the state. In the case of New York, it worked out for the better. Maybe it was just too obvious. All right, well, then we've got other examples. We've got Philadelphia with what you'll refer to as the most complex of these westward reaches, by far the most complex. And in the case of the reach west by Philadelphia, what did the Pennsylvanians prove? The Pennsylvanians proved that they can pretty much do anything when they put their minds to it, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to pay off. Okay, so kind of a good Pennsylvania German attitude that we're gonna do this by golly, and they did it, but it's kind of overkill. And then Boston was essentially without much of a hinterland anyway. They continued to be Atlantic focused and finance focused. They financed a lot of the stuff. So, all right, moving on. 1820. What do we look at? What are we looking at in terms of population? Well, in 1820, there were a few sort of. You can see the eastern seaboard is pretty much filling up with more than 6 people per square mile, but there were a few holes like northern Maine. Northern Maine was still pretty wilderness, so pretty much inaccessible. We got this place up here in northern New York. What's that? The Adirondack Mountains, exactly. The Adirondacks were never attractive for farmers because, well, too far north, short growing season, inaccessibility, very difficult terrain. The Adirondacks would continue to be pretty much a low population area until the railroads came through in the 1890s, early part of the 20th century, and only because popular culture provided a reason to do that. In fact, the Adirondacks, what are the Adirondacks and the Atlantic coast of South Florida have in common? Well, they both they were both backwaters, and then okay, thank you very much. They were both inaccessible backwaters that nobody really paid any attention to. Okay. And until the railroad tapped into them as places for people to go on vacation, to leave, and mostly from New York City. So New York City, basically the Adirondacks wound up becoming a tourism mecca later on, and so did South Florida. Anyway, northern Pennsylvania, the Alleghenies up here in northern Pennsylvania, also just because of their isolation generally, not a lot of people up here, not a lot of good land. Most of the best farmland is right along the Lake Erie Plains, Lake Ontario Plains, and then Appalachia and northern Pennsylvania, both basically the same reason. Small farms, not very much good farmland available except for subsistence agriculture. So those are sort of the backwaters by 1820. We're going to focus on this region right through here in terms of developing ties to different regions. Now, before we go there, I want us to make a distinction between, I'm going to say on camera, I guess I can stay over here, but the distinctions between what we might call the classical school of economics, or today we would call it neoclassical economics, but we'll say the classical economics, and what became known as the American School of Economics, sometimes referred to as the American system or the American national system, or philosophy of economics. And this is a philosophy of development, not economics, but a philosophy of development. If you're familiar with the term liberalism, how many of you ever heard of that term, liberal? Oh, come on. I know, are you awake? Everybody's heard of that, right? Now, what does the general Joe on the street know about the term liberal today, 2020 in Oklahoma? If you were to go out there on Knobloch or Duck Street and just pull somebody off the, you go to Walmart, that's the best place to go. Go to Walmart, that's where you get a nice slice of humanity, right? Go to Walmart in the parking lot and ask, what is a liberal? What are they going to tell you?
I don't think that question can be answered the same now
It's not going to be answered the same?
as it would have been in this time period.
Well, okay, all right. But what are we going to expect? They're going to say, well, that's somebody who's pro-government, and that's somebody who's going to vote for the Democrats, and that's somebody who maybe is open-minded, and maybe somebody who is generally all right with paying taxes, and what else?
Progressive.
Rights for people, fighting climate change, fighting injustice and that sort of thing, okay? All right, so that's what most people think of the term liberal today, but that is not anything close to what I'm meaning here, okay? Liberalism in this sense is a term that refers to an idea that generally goes to Adam Smith in the late 18th century, a philosophy of choice, a philosophy of government staying out of the affairs of the individual. Openness for sure, freedom for sure, but this is not what, the whole idea of liberalism is that the government would not have control over the means of production, that government would have basically hands off, and you probably know that term laissez-faire a little bit better. So liberalism and laissez-faire go together well. In terms of control, the classical school is one that says things should be local, things should be autonomous, and therefore centralized power is not a good thing, okay? So let's compare the classical school with the American school. The American school was emerged out of the lessons of mercantilism. It's not quite mercantilism, but it's definitely a way of centralizing public revenue and centralizing some power in order to focus development and provide incentives for capitalists to do things that will help the development process over time. In other words, it's government planning to a degree, using market forces, not socialism or not communism, but sort of harnessing market forces to project the long-term goals of the state, okay? It may not make a lot of sense to you yet, but what I'm saying is that, and by the way, if we look at political parties, the classical school of economics in American politics, the Democratic Republicans with Thomas Jefferson would have been probably the best party other than the English Whigs, the old Whigs, to call themselves liberals or to call themselves people associated with this column of thought. Free enterprise, limited government, free trade, non-interventionist government that is and the thing is, of course, Thomas Jefferson was the one who passed the Embargo Act and the tariff, the second tariff act. Yet his political philosophy went against that. Okay? The American school, and so the Democratic Republicans during the very earliest sort of, what do we call that, the political school or the first republic. And then the Democrats, the Jacksonian Democrats who followed them would have also been aligned with this category, okay? Jacksonian Democrats, and who were some more Jacksonian Democrats who followed Jackson in presidential terms? Van Buren, Martin Van Buren, okay, his hand-picked successor, right? Huh?
Madison.
James Madison, the contemporary of Thomas Jefferson, I would say yes, okay? I didn't put Madison up there. So anyway, you've got, although I'm not real sure about Madison because, well, he argued with Alex.
Lines, but
He argued with Hamilton, right? He argued a lot with Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists. But Madison would have been the guy on the left there, okay? I don't mean left, right politically, but just the guy on the left column. Hamilton, on the other hand, would have been over here on the right, okay? Hamilton was very much of the American school. Now, the American school usually refers to an approach of the United States government from the Civil War, beginning with Abraham Lincoln, until about the Nixon administration, okay? And then, or maybe even the Carter administration, but the Reagan revolution of the 1980s ended that. So this is the American school is usually associated with the period after the Civil War. But what I'm saying is the underpinnings were there, they just weren't predominant until after the Civil War, okay? What did we have? Throughout the first half of the 19th century, it was very much driven by ideas on this left side column, the classical school, private enterprise and that sort of thing. But we're going to see some examples of the American school sort of emerging during this period. So other examples, free trade versus protectionism. What does that mean? The classical school would support anything, it would be against anything that would inhibit trade, all right? Anything that would inhibit immigration, all right? So it's not the state that is prime, it is the market, okay? And so for that reason, a lot of folks will say, well, the libertarians or the anarchists are anti-state. Well, they're not really anti-state, but they don't want the state calling the shots. They want the state to be intentionally weaker, weaker than the individual. The American school, on the other hand, would seek out to have centralization, would want to direct development. And of course, Henry Clay and Alexander Hamilton are two individuals in American history who would have personified this approach. Henry Clay is actually considered the founder of the American school of thought, but Alexander Hamilton, of course, as the treasurer of the United States, created an architecture of the United States financial system that was really in line with this idea. So centralization, strategic planning, the creation of a national bank in which the national bank would focus on, or the national bank would encourage investment in infrastructure, encourage investment in things that were considered to be positive routes to development rather than gambling on innovations and big profits. So things like internal improvements were considered something very important for the state to sponsor and to encourage. While in the classical school, the classical economists would have said, leave everything to the entrepreneur regardless of the state. The states shouldn't be involved with that. Otherwise, you have what's referred to as interventionism. And John Maynard Keynes, it looks like Keynes, but it's John Maynard Keynes, after World War I, and then after he didn't live much longer after World War II, but during the 1920s and 30s and 40s, the West, both Europe and the United States, largely adopted what is referred to as Keynesian economics, which is interventionist, and one in which the idea was, what's one of the big ideas of Keynesian economics? Anybody know? Ever heard of John Maynard Keynes? Okay, you've heard of him. And he's an interventionist. What that meant was that to Keynes, get out here, camera. To Keynes, the government had a responsibility and the power to be sort of the protector of the economy. And so whenever there was a recession, whenever there was a rapid growth followed by changes and job losses in a recession, sort of a expansion, retraction of capitalism, that the idea of interventionism or Keynesianism would be that it's the job of the federal government, particularly of the central bank, to put the brakes on expansion, on growth. How do we do that? In the central bank. Well, we set the prime rate, okay? So interest rates are under the control of the central bank. So if the economy is growing very, very rapidly, and expanding very rapidly, it's perceived that that could lead to a recession or even a depression. So the idea is, what do you do with what does toying around with the interest rates do to the economy?
Slows it down.
It slows growth. It slows growth. It puts it reduces the money supply. Okay, so when you increase interest rates, what's happened to the money supply? And the money supply goes down, so it's like less fuel for the fire. Okay, sorry, I'm not explaining. It's not an economics class. I realize that, but so the central bank is sort of at the helm. That's the whole idea of Keynesian economics, is that the central bank has a role to play. When the economy slows down too much and there's not enough growth, what does the central bank do? Reduces interest rates, puts a little fuel on the fire, with the idea that the central bank can actually make adjustments to drive and to keep the employment rate at a healthy level. So if employment, if the economy slows and employment is growing, then what does the central bank do to prime the pump a little bit? Reduces interest rates, puts more money into the system, allows more investment, increases jobs, okay? Well, that's the whole idea of Keynesian economics, is that the government can and should intervene in the economy all the time, okay? It should just be a management sort of role for the federal government through the central bank. Okay, so let's talk about it. My gosh, I can ramble on about nothing forever, can't I? All right, this is the Canal era. We're going to talk about the Canal era, 1825 to about 1860. We'll stop at the Civil War, because after the Civil War, you get some innovations that we'll talk about later, and that largely, they don't replace the canal system overnight, but they make the canal system redundant and obsolete, okay? So this is a National Geographic map from, it's not the greatest map, but it shows you some of the main canals, and we're going to talk about just a few of these. We're going to talk about this one from Cumberland, Maryland / Virginia to Washington, D.C. Okay. And we're going to talk about this crazy series of canals and railroads from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. How many of you have ever driven across Pennsylvania? It's a beautiful state, isn't it? But it's hilly and it rolls and it's got big forests and it takes a while. It actually doesn't take nearly as long now because of the turnpikes, but it's a beautiful drive across from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. And then another one we're going to talk about, another canal is this little tiny one right up here, the Middlesex Canal between Boston and Lowell, Massachusetts, up in northeastern Massachusetts. And then, of course, the other, a couple more we'll talk about is the one that you're probably already familiar with, the Erie Canal, which generally connects Albany on the Hudson River with Buffalo on the shores of Lake Erie. The other one we'll look at is what's referred to as the Ohio and Erie Canal System, which is a pretty complex system, but actually runs right through sort of eastern southern Ohio. So let's talk about these canals, and then I'll tell you why I'm selecting these individually. Let's look at the first one, the Middlesex Canal up in Massachusetts. It's only 27 miles long. Why would I bring this one up as an example? Well, it's one of the first ones that's built in the United States, the first canals operating in the United States. It operated from about 1803, so it took a decade to build, from 1793 to 1803. It opens up, it's only 27 miles long, only has 20 locks. What's a lock?
And you can put water in it or take water out of and like change the levels in order
Got it. Yeah, the lock is the part of the canal that allows the vertical movement of the boat. So either if you're going upstream, it raises the boat up to the next level, or if you're coming downstream, it lowers it down to the next level. So 20 locks over 27 miles, okay? And you might think, well, man, that would be slow. But it is slow, but it's not as slow as moving freight over land, and it's definitely not as expensive as moving freight over land. And it's a lot more reliable. And so this connected the Merrimack River up in northern Massachusetts to Boston Harbor. And so it was an early attempt to expand the moving of freight and the moving of goods into a big city and into a port city. One of the interesting things about the Middlesex Canal is it's not only it's one of the earliest ones in the United States, but it was also the first one supposedly to use Portland cement, hydraulic cement, to pour the locks. So what does that mean? It means this is concrete that can set underwater. The cement is what could set underwater. You didn't have to dry out. Okay, it's a chemical reaction. So this was kind of a breakthrough in technology. And of course, it wasn't all American. It was imported from the British canal builders and the French and Belgian canals in Europe. And you know, we were the beneficiaries, or at least in New England, they were able to hire these folks and utilize this experience and technology to build a 27-mile long canal through relatively flat country, or level country. And another reason I would identify the Middlesex Canal is because this canal was what made Lowell, Massachusetts into an industrial town. And Lowell, Massachusetts, you probably know, if you're maybe a history major, Lowell, Massachusetts is considered one of the very first American industrial towns in New England, one of the hearths, I guess, of the American Industrial Revolution. Now, of course, it's a lot later than the English and the English Industrial Revolution, but Lowell, Massachusetts would become famous as its own industrial town. It's sort of the early ground zero, if you will, of industrial development in the United States. All right, so lots of engineering feats, like, for example, in the case of the Middlesex Canal, the canal had to cross rivers that were going, at a 90-degree angle across from them. So engineers were able to raise the canals above the rivers, and so you have canals that flow across rivers, all right, rather than into the rivers. So it's like a highway bridge, but it's carrying water, okay, across the streams. So this was one thing that was maybe pretty impressive. There were other things like floating track lines that anyway, move on. So anyway, the Middlesex Canal, not very big, but it's where the folks like DeWitt Clinton and the investors from New York City who were had this idea of a canal that would connect Lake Erie to the Hudson River. That's where they cut their teeth. It's sort of where they got some experience and they got some ideas. They studied the Middlesex Canal and tried to implement that in a much larger scale across the state of New York. Here's a map of, you can't see it much here, but a map of the Middlesex Canal. This is Boston Harbor here, and Boston Harbor here actually. And so this is the outlet of the canal, and then the canal runs right up through here. This is an old map. So you can see Boston City. Now, today this would all be Boston, Boston metropolitan area. But like, here's Boston, and this is Cambridge, Massachusetts, where MIT and Harvard are. Or this is Cambridge right here, sorry, Cambridge. This is like Roxbury, Brookline, the famous suburbs around Boston. So it goes all the way up to the Merrimack River off the map to Lowell, and Lowell then would have the accessibility to Boston and to the Atlantic world as a manufacturing hub, textile manufacturing. Okay, so let's move on. DeWitt Clinton. DeWitt Clinton was the mayor of New York City and later governor of the state of New York, who was in favor of this huge project to build a canal between Lake Erie and the Hudson River, which would, of course, make it New York City's canal, or access to New York City. All right, so he was able to eventually get $7 million, and this is at 1817 dollars. $7 million in state funding from the New York legislature. So what kind of system, or what kind of economic philosophy would we be talking about here?
American system.
The American system, for sure. You see that? So not, up to this point, it was individual entrepreneurs doing things, but why would Clinton want to get public funding for this? It's just too much money, right? It's just like, who's got $10 billion to spend on something, So it probably just, wasn't able to get investors to do it. I don't know. I don't really know the reasons why the legislature eventually did this rather than having a private, folks do it. But it was most definitely funded by the state of New York. And what happened? Well, it was built between 1817 and 1825. It's a 363-mile-long canal, which mostly improved the existing Mohawk River, which is going through a flat area. So, Mohawk River was meandering all over the place. And so they straightened it out They utilized the river they utilized the water that would flow into the Mohawk River Valley, and essentially connected Lake Erie to the Hudson, so that you could go ocean-going vessels get up the Hudson and then offload to river vessels or to canal vessels, which are actually pretty small. And so you had transport over the canal from Albany basically to Buffalo. And then once at the Great Lakes, Buffalo, you could access any area that you get to on the Great Lakes. So the Hudson Valley connected to the Great Lakes system via the Erie Canal. And that created instant success. We were talking about this a little bit earlier in a different class. The cost of moving a ton of freight from Buffalo to Albany, New York, fell from $100 per ton to $10 per ton literally overnight. So it was not only faster and more and safer, but it was much cheaper. And my analogy to this is, okay, I looked up this morning, I thought, what's it cost? I can fly out of Stillwater now. What does it cost to fly from Stillwater to London, England? Like if I wanted to do that. So I got on Google Flights and I thought, okay, I found some pretty cheap flights, but about the cheapest flight other than the red eye crazy cheap flight was around $1,100. Okay, now you can pay $2,500 if you want, but about $1,100 is a good rate. 6 weeks ahead of time, that sort of thing. Can you imagine that falling by 10 times overnight? So suddenly you wake up and it's like the plane ticket to go from Stillwater to London is $110. Yippee! What's that? I'm going to go. So what the idea here is, what sort of opportunities does the falling of freight rates what kind of opportunities does that open up? What kind of effect is that going to have? So essentially, the Great Lakes region, the whole region surrounding the Great Lakes, becomes a hinterland that becomes accessible to New York City by water transport. Water transport is this magical sort of thing because it's cheap. All right, it's really, really cheap to move lots of freight by water, even in a canal. It also increased the ability for passenger traffic between the Middle West and New York City. All right, I'm running out of time, darn it. So we're going to continue the canals into next week, I reckon. So anyway, this was, a lot of people criticized Clinton for his pushing this thing. There were all sorts of names. DeWitt's Ditch, Clinton's Big Ditch, Clinton's Folly. You've probably heard of that one. But this is one example that, the guy proved them all wrong. He was right. And it allowed New York City to, remember, before this got going, New York City was competing with Philadelphia and Boston to be the largest city. And, well, maybe it had surpassed that by that time, but New York City began to grow like gangbusters after the Erie Canal opened in the 1820s. So I'll see you next Monday, and we'll continue on talking about canals, and hopefully we'll get into a little bit of railroads by that time. And we'll talk about some technological advances, and hopefully I can get the by that time too. So y'all have a good weekend. Maybe we'll get some more snow.